Okay, well, welcome everyone to our seminar today. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Tracey Wagner-Rizvi join us. But before we get started, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. And as this is a hybrid event and some of us are in different territories, please take the time and space to give thanks and gratitude and respect to the land you're currently living and working on. And today, here on the York University campus, we're situated on the traditional territorial area known as Tkaronto, and we acknowledge its current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We also acknowledge this as the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And we also would like to think of this as just the first step and to reach out, build relations with, support, and learn from our Indigenous communities. So again, we're very delighted that Dr. Tracey Wagner-Rizvi can be here today with us. She holds a PhD and an MA in global governance from the Dahdaleh School of International Affairs at University of Waterloo, with a focus on global social governance and human rights and global justice. She's currently a research associate at the Global Strategy Lab here at York, where she researches the governance of antimicrobial resistance. Prior to that, she was a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh, looking at the conduct and influence of producers of unhealthy commodities, especially tobacco, alcohol, and ultra-processed foods, in driving consumption. She previously lived in Pakistan for 13 years, and during that time she worked for UNICEF, local and international governmental organizations, and a national newspaper, and briefly in 2002 for an NGO in Afghanistan. She campaigned for legislation in Pakistan banning the marketing of baby formula and observed firsthand the baby food industry's influence on both national and global health policy and policy making, leading to her career-long interest in corporate political activism. So thank you so much, Tracey, and over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you today. I'm just going to try to share my presentation as well. Right, so the title today is Letting the Fox Build the Hen House and Private Sector Influence at the WHO, and that's I'm getting at in the bigger picture how we're designing sort of policymaking spaces or hen houses while allowing the fox the potential threat to some of what goes on in those spaces to determine how they're built and how they're able to increase their access and influence. And a quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. It's sort of in three parts. First little bit is about just reviewing again WHO significance as the lead agency for health and the types of pressures that it's under currently, historically and currently. Then I'll go into a bit about the commercial influence on substantive policy. So what kinds of policies on specific topics or in specific policy areas. And I'll be focusing in that point on commercial milk formula for babies or baby food, and soda, which is two areas that I've looked at a little bit more expressly. And then looking at WHO moving towards a widening of its engagement with the non-state actors, culminating through a series of policies, culminating in the framework of engagement with non-state actors, and then looking at some of the potential risks for that and what that might also mean for global governance more broadly in a sense. Right. So this is nothing new to any of you. I just want to emphasize that the WHO is the only international body that comprises all the member states of the United Nations. So because of that, it has this unique political legitimacy. The idea behind it is that the states all come together, one vote, one state, one vote. It's considered to be, it's designed in a democratic manner, to function in a democratic manner. It's supposed to have accountability mechanisms built in, and that this doesn't exist in any other of the more recent entities that have been created as part of the global health architecture. The main decision-making body of the WHO is the World Health Assembly, and that is the only place where global health rules can be negotiated, adopted, and monitored for compliance. I should note that the WHO doesn't have any sort of enforcement mechanism. It is still, it's not an enforcing body. It doesn't have the ability to do that. We've seen, though, historically, there's been a move globally towards neoliberalism and austerity throughout the 1990s, throughout the 1980s and 90s, especially, and that resulted in more market-based policy responses. There was commodification, privatization, goods and services were liberalized, and there was an individualization of risk and responsibility. So during this time, states were less willing to finance these sorts of intergovernmental platforms. And in fact, they placed caps on their assessed contributions, the amount of their funding contributions that go towards the core activities of the WHO. And instead, there was more tied aid that led to more vertical initiatives that focused on specific issues, especially HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria. So they were all very vertical instead of having a more holistic program of operation. So to try to bridge these gaps, the WHO shifted more and more towards partnerships and collaborations with the private sector or through multi-stakeholder initiatives and public-private partnerships. This isn't only the case for WHO, it's across the board, across the UN system. And in fact, this idea of partnerships is even enshrined in the Millennium Development Goals, Goal 8, and the Sustainable Development Goals, and Goal 17 rather. So it's become the preferred model as part of new initiatives. And a lot of questions have been raised about WHO's mandate and its effectiveness. And it's kind of a catch-22 that the more that there's especially this rose around the Ebola outbreaks. There's a heavy call for review about what is the WHO for, what is it able to do in response to such a situation. So there's less funding than going towards WHO because there's doubts about whether it is the best location for this kind of work. And as a result of having less core funding, it reinforces that inability to respond in the way that WHO may want to be able to. And those calls for reform and transformation continue even now as we see more and more global health entities being created, global public-private partnerships, for example, and other sorts of multi-stakeholder initiatives that are sort of sidelining to some extent some of the work that WHO might be expected to do. So as I said, that the WHO lacks this regulatory or enforcement authority mechanisms, but it's still a significant site for political activity by corporations and their business associations, such as baby food and soda industries. And because of that, they seek to influence both substantive policy recommendations and also paradigms relating to health itself, to their products, and to their role as governance actors. Corporate actors then shape political environment, they shape governance and policy preferences and perceptions of issues, as well as about their role in solving them. Commercial entities, companies, and their business associations have established quite a track record of using strategies and tactics that are common across industries and across sectors. That these strategies and tactics have come to be known as the corporate playbook. It's not anywhere published, but it's just a collection of strategies that have been observed across all industries and sectors. And they use these to influence these substantive initiatives in order to serve their own interests. And this playbook is underpinned by in my analysis, 3 dimensions of power, namely instrumental power, structural and discursive power. And these different dimensions of power overlap, and they often serve to reinforce one another. I won't get into the details of that because I'm not going to refer to that much in this presentation, but if anyone's interested in hearing more about those dimensions of power, I'm happy to discuss that afterwards. So besides looking at substantive policy, corporations also engage in what I call a long game to shape paradigms. And this is really where they're trying to shape the ideas that are more conducive to them achieving their own goals as profit-making entities and as well as policy-making and governance actors. So I'll start with a look at the commercial milk formula for babies example, sometimes called baby food, baby milk. At the time that the WHO introduced its main policy around, in this area, it were referred to as breast milk substitutes. And I should say it includes more than just milks and formulas. It's also cereals and foods and all the apparatus that is used in conjunction with them. I want to stress that this isn't about the availability of these products. They'll still be available in the market for purchase, and people are free to use them, to purchase them and use them. It's about the marketing, how they're put into the market, and about the information that is accurate and independent from industry influence. And there's lots of really subtle ways that, and not so subtle ways, that the baby food industry has used to shape the decisions that mothers and parents make about how they feed their babies, which I'm not going to get into today during the presentation. If you'd like to hear more about that as well, I'm happy to talk about that too. So the main regulation at the global level around, it's not even a regulation, it's a code. It's called the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, and it was adopted in 1981 in response to what was this link between increased marketing of these products and decreasing breastfeeding rates and practices, and the ultimate the health outcomes that were being observed. So in somewhere like Canada, this might be just a simple matter of how we're feeding a baby, but in some places it really can be, and it has been, a matter of life and death. So the code doesn't have any enforcement, of course. National governments are to introduce legislation that gives that legislative power to implementing the code. So during the development of this code, there was a lot of lobbying by the baby food industry. Nestle had just been involved in a libel case where it sued a student group about some of the publications that they had made about their baby food marketing practices. And in response to that, because of that and the negative publicity around that, they formed a business association that was intended to do its lobbying on its behalf. So it joined with 7 other baby food companies to form this business association. They also found allies not only in other baby food companies, but in governments of milk producing countries, especially the US, but also Switzerland. They are heavy milk producing producers, but also home to baby food companies like Nestle in Switzerland, and Abbott, Wyeth, and a number of others are based in the US. Another tactic that was observed during that time was what's called the revolving door, and that is where they would hire somebody from a influential office to be part of their association and lobby on their behalf, bringing with them those contacts and insider information that might be beneficial to their efforts. So for example, the business association hired the former US Undersecretary of State, who held meetings with other delegates at the WHO and a retiring WHO Assistant General. apparently retiring, but there's some suggestion that he may have been working for them even before his official retirement. Another strategy was calling for voluntary measures, saying that they would change this practice or that practice instead of having a code that was formalized and mandatory for them to abide by and comply with. There was a lot of whining and dining, especially by Nestle. These negotiations were taking place in Geneva, which is not far from the Nestle headquarters. So they hosted a hospitality suite and would take delegates out for dinner as well during the negotiations. So this is kind of influence that's not available to everyone, but companies certainly have the resources to be able to undertake this kind of influencing efforts. The companies made it very clear that they weren't going to comply if there weren't certain changes made. They called the code unfeasible. They said it was wholly irresponsible and potentially even dangerous. It was detailed. It was overly restrictive. Not any number of criticisms. They said it was unworkable and unrealistic. Finally, eventually, once a draft had been agreed upon and was about to be put before the World Health Assembly, the US said that they didn't want it presented as a regulation, which is more binding, and instead they wanted to see it as a recommendation. And it was decided in the Secretariat that probably a wide acceptance or even universal acceptance of the code as a recommendation was better than not having one at all because it had failed as a regulation. So as I said, the US pressured for this change, and they indicated that they were going to support the code as a recommendation. But after Ronald Reagan was elected, their position changed, and they ultimately were the only country out of all at the World Health Assembly who voted against it. So after the code was adopted, the companies immediately had to figure out how they're going to continue promoting their products in a way that still made a profit. And one of the ways that they did that was introducing new products. And their strategy was to create doubt about what was covered by the code. By introducing these new products, they introduced a new thing called follow-up milk, which didn't exist up until that point. And it was argued that the code only applies to that time up to as long as exclusive breastfeeding was recommended, which at that time was 4 months, and any milk that was marketed for use after that time wasn't covered by the code. And the World Health Assembly repeatedly said, no, we mean all of the duration of breastfeeding. So after that, you can say setback, companies introduced yet another product called growing up milk, which is extended beyond the toddler ages and into preschool ages even, and also milk for pregnant mothers, which they marketed. I've shown an example here of 4 different products. I don't think one of these, maybe I think one of them isn't the mother's milk, but the idea was to have very similar packaging, so that even if you were marketing something that the companies were marketing something that they argued was outside of the scope of the code, indirectly they were also marketing the products that were within the scope of the code. And as I said, though, again, the World Health Assembly passed many resolutions clarifying what they meant by the scope of the code, and that it did include all of these products. So there's a lot of debate as well by the companies around that duration of exclusive breastfeeding. At the time the code was adopted, I believe it was 4 months. The recommendation got changed to 4 to 6 months. There was discussion around expanding it and a lot of resistance from the baby food companies. The World Health Assembly wanted to have a resolution passed extending that duration to around 6 months. And the companies really resisted that because that meant an extra couple of months that they weren't, by their argumentation, able to market their other milk products or the cereals that they also sold as a part of feeding babies. So there's been some heavy-handed measures as well, besides just lobbying and interventions with delegates and at around the World Health Assembly. For example, in 2018, when there was a resolution being put forward about this duration of exclusive breastfeeding, the U.S. delegation threatened to impose trade sanctions or withdraw military aid for any countries that supported the resolution. So that's a good example of finding that allyship with the U.S. A common strategy as well as forum shopping. The baby food companies pushed to postpone this discussion around another one of these resolutions about exclusive breastfeeding age duration, because there was another meeting at Codex Alimentarius where labeling standards were going to be set, and that is it's a more conducive environment for them. They thought they would have a better chance of winning their position there. And once those standards were set, it wouldn't matter as much what the World Health Assembly resolution stated. So they were trying to push for that to be delayed in order to get their advantage at the Codex. Turning now to soda. So compared with the baby food industry, there's fewer substantive policy initiatives that relate exclusively to soda. This is partly because it's a more recent phenomenon or concern, and also because it's a less attributable connection. The causal relationship isn't as clear between marketing and consumption of soda and health outcomes. So soda isn't the exclusive cause of, for example, diabetes or obesity or other non-communicable diseases, but there's a lot of evidence pointing towards its consumption as a contributing factor or even a key driver in the global rise of these illnesses. So here again, we see the soda industry manufacturing doubt and pointing out that there's that weak causal relationship and questioning the effects of soda consumption on health, on rates of diabetes or obesity. And they question the legitimacy of the evidence that does seem to suggest that. Here too, they find allies in the US and other countries with sugar-dependent economies. They formed business associations. Here, their groupings are around food and beverage or grocers, and as well a lot of sugar associations. There are many actually sugar associations, business associations. And so the soda companies are all part of those business associations as well. And that tends to be where they focus their effort. It's not about soda as a product, but about levels of sugar consumption. And here too, we see them offering to make voluntary measures and actually, in fact, even implementing voluntary measures and arguing that there's no need for regulation. They can take care of it themselves. So the way that translates is into reformulation and voluntarily lowering the levels of sugar in their products, so that even if people are consuming the same volume of the product, they're consuming less sugar and coming within guidelines. But even so, it doesn't come within the recommendations that are being put forward by technical groups. It's lower than their previous product. And so they say that they can take care of these things voluntarily rather than having a more stringent level imposed on them through policies at the global level. And they also introduced new products, again, a widening of the diet soda products or reduced sugar products or reduced food products, reduced sugar level products. Here, the messaging is around individual responsibility. They emphasize as well energy balance, so that it's not the soda is the problem, but also that it's not being balanced with a similar level of exercise. And in fact, they even formed a research center that was focused on this idea of energy balance. Their messaging stresses as well that there's no good or bad foods. So all of these things may be true, but they are using this kind of framing to overcompensate for some of the more harmful practices that they do, and to detract away from the need for guidelines on sugar limits and marketing limits and other such things that they oppose. So one way that they also did that through to oppose these restrictive recommendations is to weaken the language. So in one example, they when there's some guidelines recommending a decrease in sugar levels, instead of taking a specific limit, 10% of the diet and even 5% was being considered in one example, instead of taking these very specific measurable limits, instead they successfully lobbied to have the recommendation be a general reduction in sugar consumption. So it took away that measurable aspect and just left it up to people to determine what was an acceptable reduction for them. In some recommendations as well about fiscal policies on how to address non-communicable diseases, the soda industry through the U.S. commissioner, this was for a high-level commission on NCDs, they removed soda as being a product suitable for taxation as a way of redressing non-communicable diseases. Tobacco and alcohol were listed, but soda had been there in an earlier draft, and it was removed in the one that was finally approved. Right, so both industries, as I said, play this long game of shaping paradigms, and some of the messaging that they use is common. They both emphasize individual consumer choice and responsibility. They emphasize corporate responsibility, that they are a trustworthy actor, they are responsible and trustworthy in informing the policies, and that they want to be part of the solution. That gets repeated quite often. So all of this is to emphasize and legitimize these industries as governance actors. So they're seeking not only influence over the policymaking table, but actually a seat at it. So these paradigms that they're using to shape the policymaking environment and even mechanisms create an environment that's conducive to arguing against regulation and in favor of voluntary measures, and to representing themselves as appropriate partners, not only for consultation, but as equal partners in this capacity. Right, so the WHO has engaged with non-state actors since its founding. It's mentioned collaboration with NGOs in particular is mentioned in the WHO Constitution, and in the same assembly where the Constitution was adopted, it's the founding Constitution in 1948, they also adopted working principles on relations between NGOs and the WHO. There weren't any guidelines on collaborating or engaging with the private sector at that time. Those principles were revised over the years at various intervals, most recently in 1987, the most recent principles governing relations between the WHO and NGOs. Those principles they offered a official relations status to NGOs. So those groups that had official relations status would have, they would gain certain privileges. They'd be able to attend the governing meetings and governing body meetings and make interventions. It increased their power and credibility and legitimacy. And one of the criteria for groups to be conferred with this status was that they had to be free from commercial interests. So no companies were to be. granted official relations status. But over the years, we did see that some business groups were, and it was a bit of a gray area, if they could establish that they had enough of an arm's length distance from the profit-making bodies, the companies, that they could sometimes, there were a number that were granted official relations status, to much controversy. But for the private sector, in 2001, there were guidelines adopted on working with the private sector to achieve health outcomes. And again, this doesn't grant official relations status to the private sector entities. So there are a number of kind of starts and goes about to try to change, to update those policies, especially, sorry if I can just check back, a 2002 review of the principles on engaging with NGOs. In 2002, this review deemed it inadequate. There was a proposal in 2004 for updating it, but that process got abandoned. And it wasn't really until as part of a reform for the future financing the WHO, which started really in 2011, but the mandate for these new proposals came in May of 2012, where the member states requested new policies for expanding stakeholder engagement. So the purpose of these new policies was said to be to facilitate wider engagement with non-state actors, to attract new voluntary funding, and to protect WHO's mandate and guard against conflicts of interest, or rather to manage them. That's the language that is used. And when I say to attract new voluntary funding, that really speaks to those pressures that the WHO was under. And there were a number of instances where the Secretariat made it very clear that that was an intended purpose. But then at other times they would deny that. They would say it's not about funding at all. It's about better collaboration and more effective collaboration, and funding was the least of the concerns. But as I said, at other times they said, yes, this is actually a very central point. So there are 4 contentious years of development between when this was requested and when it was adopted. So I'm going to just highlight 2 of the main points of contention. One was around the types of actors. So initially it was a request for reviewing the guidelines and engaging with NGOs, but very quickly it became expanded to engagement with all non-state actors. And the WHA, the World Health Assembly, requested separate policies for NGOs and private sector. At one point, the Secretariat grouped these together. They aggregated them all into one category of non-state actors, but there's a lot of pushback on that, and again, they were distinguished. So notably, Switzerland was one of the delegates that was arguing against differentiation. They thought it should be all non-state actors treated the same. As I mentioned, that's where Nestle is based. And there's been a fair bit of revolving door from the Swiss government and the World Health Organization. Business associations in making their interventions and contributions to consultations around the development of this new framework, they expressed concern about being excluded. They were concerned about there being a hierarchy amongst the different types of non-state actors, and they called these categorizations arbitrary, which I think other delegations, they contended that in fact they are different. They have different objectives. The WHO has to treat different types of actors in different capacity, in different ways. So that was again, the types of actors were again differentiated. Another big point of contention was around conflicts of interest, and what constitutes a conflict of interest was a major conceptual difference. So there seemed to be a blurring of conflicts of interest being an internal problem within WHO where its primary purpose or interest might be compromised by a secondary interest versus between two WHO and other actors, where they may have competing interests or they may have interests that are indirect conflict with the WHO's interests. So, for example, the WHO does not engage at all with the tobacco industry, and any group that's promoting their interests, and also with the arms industry. But they do engage with other industries where they produce products that are also health harming, but not so fundamentally health harming as WHO views tobacco and the arms industry. So there's a difference between internal conflicts of interest and competing interests, and there was a lot of time spent debating those. What ended up happening in the final document, it does seem to follow the conflict of interest being an internal a conflict between WHO's multiple interests. But in practice, when they talk of conflict of interest, they're really talking about competing interests. So that may jeopardize in some ways or it might not jeopardize, but may impact how effective this policy might be, or there might be implications for how it's operationalized. The FENSA covers institutional conflicts of interest only, not individual conflicts of interest, which is addressed in a different policy. So finally, the framework was adopted in May 2016. It comprises an overarching framework that sets out the principles for the framework. And then as annexes, there's 4 separate policies that address each of 4 different types of non-state actors. Those being NGOs, private sector entities, philanthropic foundations, and academic institutions. As well as the framework lays out the steps for managing conflicts of interest, or where appropriate, avoiding. And these include due diligence, risk assessment, a publicly available register of non-state actors, and an electronic tool for managing individual conflicts of interest. So some of the potential risks. One big risk is that it institutionalizes the influence of private authority, whereas previously business associations, it was a gray area. It was difficult for them to get official relation status. Now they are explicitly able to be granted that status, so it boosts their position within the WHO and World Health Assembly environment. It leads to a further entrenchment of multi-stakeholderism, which can undermine and sideline WHO and its intergovernmental decision-making and coordinating mandate. And it doesn't address this core financial problem of the assessed contributions being capped by member states. So interestingly, there was a foundation created. I'm not going to talk about this now, unless if people want to hear more about it, maybe we have time in the discussion. But there's a foundation created to enable the collection of funding resources to be provided to WHO. And just very briefly, it initially said that they were going to align with the principles of FENSA. So it really wasn't clear from the outset whether FENSA was ineffective for WHO to be able to expand that financing pool, or if it was effective in constraining these kinds of financial contributions, in which case, why would the foundation say that it's going to align with those similar constraints? Anyways, the foundation gradually walked back from some of those commitments. Yeah, it's a whole other case that's interesting to discuss because of its use of FENSA in how it was presenting itself as well as trustworthy. Yeah, it had some hiccups along the way. And if we look more broadly going forward, it's clear that there is a need for transformation of the global health architecture. For the time being, at least, and perhaps going forward, WHO remains the key multilateral forum on global health governance. Whether it's WHO or a new global health architecture, it's essential that we protect and promote the public interest and common good. And we can do that by strengthening democratic processes and structures, prioritizing popular health over corporate power, protect and promote and fulfill human rights by enforcing standards and punishing violations, and invigorating multilateralism and protecting it against efforts to undermine it. And again, protecting policymaking against commercial influence and interference. So while we have WHO, at least as the key multilateral forum, it's essential to protect its independence, integrity, credibility, and reputation. And that's the end there. I'll wrap up, and I'm happy to pick up any of those pieces or others in discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tracey. Thank you, Tracey. That was great. So we are now available for questions, and I don't know if anyone would like to begin. Go ahead, Gus.
Thanks, Dr. Tracey. It's a wonderful presentation. And of course, we had some chat related to this commercial determinants of health, the private influence in a various dimensions, including Pakistan or India. We had a quick chat in the past. So my question is, here in your concluding slide in the way forward, there is a terminology called as punish the violations. So, but how much it is possible or practically feasible, especially taking the private sector and punishing them in the lens of commercial determinants of health? That is question one, because for them, they as a multinational or a transnational corporations, they have all the kind of setup. But as an individual person, or even a person from a public health organization, maybe from India or from Canada, how much I have resources to kind of go and fight with them and then get them punished. And even WHO, what kind of power it has to punish those violations. So that is question one. So I will kind of ask the second question after there are a lot of hands.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. And WHO doesn't have the ability to punish like that. So that might be something to think about if we are transforming the global health architecture, which there's a lot of discussion currently around what that should look like. Maybe that's something that we want to consider if there is need for something like that. Really, the only UN body, intergovernmental body like that has that punishing capacity, or the major one anyways, is WTO, that does have some a bit of mechanism for that. Maybe that's something we want to consider introducing to the global health architecture. But in the meantime, it comes to states. So states still are the site for enforcement. So for example, with the baby food example, the code was adopted by the World Health Assembly, but then every country had to introduce law. That, of course, allows governments to introduce stronger measures, or it also could end up being weakened. And so every country goes through that same struggle with lobbying at that level by the baby food industry to try to weaken the resulting legislation or to drag it out. So that's what I witnessed in Pakistan, that it went through I think we were up to at least the 9th draft when I was actively involved with that, because there would be so much pushback and challenging and then reversal of decisions, and just trying to drag out the process, because the longer it's not a law, then the longer they can continue what they're doing. So it is a difficult way of doing it, but the WHO doesn't have any authority or mandate to introduce enforceable mechanisms. So it's a challenge, but I still I see that that work at the global level as being a tool that national groups, national governments can refer to as well and say, well, look, Ministry of Health, you agreed to this at the World Health Assembly, so now let's implement it. So it can be used in that way to try to introduce those enforcement mechanisms at the national level. But it's definitely a challenge.
Okay, thank you, Tracey. So let's go to online. Hand up first. Michael, can you go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for your presentation. Very interesting. I think we both know that global governance is intensively process-oriented issue, and your examples relate to go between substantive policy, governance policy processes, which is one extreme of that spectrum in global governance, and advocacy, which is another. And I was wondering perhaps whether you have gathered enough empirical evidence to at least suggest, or by way of characterizing global governance between these extremes.
Sorry, to characterize?
Global health governance between substantive issue-oriented governance and advocacy.
And advocacy. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is advocacy. What do you mean by advocacy? By advocacy by whom?
Well, generally, well, not generally, in particular, global governance is issue area oriented, right? So, and then depending on the international organizations, they're usually focused on particular issues within a domain. Yeah. And but my impressions from your presentation suggest that there are advocacy that are related to the domain of health, but not necessarily, the actors are not necessarily focused on substantive policy processes or issues, or issue areas rather. So between this spectrum, how would you characterize global health governance?
Well, I think global health governance, yeah, like the different types of actors have different intents, of course. I think I mean, I tend to take, it's maybe a cynical position, but I tend to take the position that if companies exist to make money, they are influencing substantive policy towards what will make them more money. It's not about, is it 10% of the diet or 5% of the diet that gives you a better health outcome. It's about what is more economical and profit making for us. And if the level gets reduced, are people less likely to buy our products and so on. And same for the long game type of thing that I was talking about, this paradigm shaping in framing, what is even the problem, what are even possible solutions. By framing something a certain way, even the problem a certain way, that can enable some solutions to be considered, while others are off the table, like they don't even enter the mind to be considered because we have only framed it in a particular way. So that kind of long game work, it is still to make sure that those policies that might affect their bottom line are kept on track for profit making. And in the long term, they're better able to do that if they are at the table. Not only that they have to lobby people at the table, or take people out to wine and dine and so on, or find allies that they may still do all of these things. But if they're at the table, they have a more, it increases their instrumental power. If we go back to my framing of power, they are able to directly influence those decisions instead of relying on other actors or taking that, arm's length kind of lobbying position. Does that get at what you were asking? I think I wasn't entirely clear. Oh, I think you're muted, Mike.
Yeah, it sounds also, based on what you just said, that health governance is more motivated by particular issues that are more, the actors are more interested in advocating rather than developing substantive health policy.
Yeah, well, in this case, I mean, the three other types of non-state actors that this framework involves, and there may be others that haven't been captured in that grouping, but some NGOs may have a similar kind of approach and motivation, as you say, while others are purely motivated by public interest. Academic institutions might have other motivations yet again, and philanthropic foundations. They're not homogenous either. There can be different motivations there, and whether they're interested in developing those, more holistic health approaches. I mean, this is still a problem. This is a problem also with my research and looking at these two issue areas. They're just snapshots to show what is happening across the board, and because I don't see these industries operating in their silos, we say in academic silos. It's not industrial silos either. These are strategies and this a shift that we're seeing across all of health, but also across environmental, climate change, plastics governance is seeing the same. Even I was listening to something recently about gun regulation and talking about how hard it's been for the Canadian government to regulate around that, because every time you say, oh, assault rifle, what does that mean? The industry changes something about the design, so it's not falling within that categorization anymore. So these are things that are across. It's not just a sector specific or industry specific thing. It's a trend that can be observed across the board.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
It also allows them to spy, right?
Spy, yeah, did you hear that?
It
No,
allows them to spy. If
spy.
they're part of the committee, yeah, it allows corporate interests to spy.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's spying anymore once they're legitimately there as stakeholders. That it gives them that insider voice, but as you say, also they're able to collect information in a different way than they would be if they were having to go through government representatives to get those their positions tabled. Yeah.
Okay, Chelsea, I think you were.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. It was making me think about how with advertising and lobbying by commercial actors, so you're saying about baby food and the soda industry, how they're strongly shaping like the public's perception. And I was thinking about how as much as they are like influencing, it can also create some maybe suspicions about corporate roles in health governance. So I was thinking about areas such as like pharmaceuticals, how commercial actors can also help with like scientific evidence and medical advances, but there's a lot of suspicions around that too. So I was just curious, like as researchers and in health, like how can we help find this balance between kind of the strong role of these actors as well as maybe their hidden agendas in a way?
Funny, during COVID, I would hear these people, so many people online and everywhere saying that they're suspicious of the pharmaceutical sector, and I'm like, I'm suspicious of the pharmaceutical sector, and I'm getting the vaccine. Like it is a tricky thing, and I was like, you need to put your suspicions at the right point. It's not so people are suspicious about how did this vaccine get developed so quickly. And that was misplaced suspicion. They're only out to make money. That is valid. That was difficult though at that time because during COVAX trying to mobilize, vaccines for low and middle income countries supposedly. But in the end, Canada had a stockpile that was like 3 times what it was necessary. So like those suspicions are warranted, but there needs to be some guide. It needs to be well targeted, if you want to say. Like you don't want misplaced suspicions, but I mean a little healthy suspicion I think is okay too. But yeah, it needs to be. We do need to be careful that it doesn't undermine good work, but at the same time, questioning where the questioning needs to happen, and maybe it's a question of timing as well. Yeah, I'm not exactly as sure. Pharmaceutical is it is also an interesting case. I largely focus on non-communicable diseases and products that are affecting that. And where they talk about being part of the solution, it's highly criticized because they are a large part of the problem as well. So it's easier to be very critical of that. But pharmaceutical side is trickier because there is a different role for pharmaceutical products than there is for tobacco. I mean, as a far extreme. It's easy to exclude entirely from conversations. With pharmaceutical products, there does need to be a different type of consultation and I don't want to go so far as to say collaboration, but there does need to be a different type of engagement. So these are the things that are tricky, and that it's one of the things I don't know that the framework of engagement has teased out enough. I think it's still heavily tilted towards, when it's talking about private sector, it's still heavily considering companies that make products that might be harmful towards non-communicable diseases, not infectious diseases. I don't think it's successfully teased that apart. Yeah, but it is a tricky thing to where to have that healthy skepticism, and where to say, wait a second, this part you can trust, but also be skeptical about this aspect.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Danielle.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Tracey, for your presentation. It's very interesting. I'm going to talk about the commercial milk formula aspect because my background's in midwifery. So I kind of come from a bit of a background that you spoke about with this exclusive breastfeeding. And I also understand the challenges of that. I mean, even in the hospital setting here, it's really easy for practitioners to move to formula when there's any kind of complications or challenge, which is valid, but I also believe that there's commercial interest in that. But my question is not really about that, but that's an interesting aspect for me that you brought forward. I'm thinking more about the dimensions of power in like humanitarian settings, for example. Do you have any thoughts, or have you come across specific policies that deal with pushback around settings where access to clean water is as a problem, which when we add clean water into formula becomes can create negative outcomes for newborns. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that part.
Yeah, there are a set of guidelines, or there is a set of guidelines that was developed about responding to humanitarian emergencies around infant formula, infant feeding. Because that is a big concern about the water access for sure. So one of the guidelines is that it shouldn't be powdered formula that's donated. It should be prepared, ready to eat formula. And another is, and because the other reason is because it can end up spilling out of the infant feeding cycle and into the general population. The other thing is that it should be purchased, not donated, actually, because then if it's donated, it's too easy to flood a emergency situation. And so mothers who might have otherwise continued breastfeeding might say, well, for the time being, I'm going to do this. And of course, that makes it very difficult to return. Yeah, I've there's more to it, of course, than that, but these are a few of the key points. But I've been questioned. It's difficult because I mean, I'm looking at Gaza and, you know, other alternatives that might have been possible in for example, a flooding, which is or earthquakes. I was in Pakistan during the big earthquake. So there's other interventions that can be put in place for distribution, first of all, and also for supporting mothers so that they're able to continue breastfeeding. It's still predominantly a breastfeeding culture. That's what you want to preserve, even in an emergency. But I'm looking at Gaza and thinking, you know, the mothers are being killed. And so even the option of wet nursing, it becomes very complicated. Prepared formula, you know, nothing is getting in. So I think it's difficult to say across the board that this is the way it needs to be, absolutely has to be. But I think in a lot of scenarios as a general guideline, yeah, there are suggestions on how to handle that, because it has been seen that companies have donated a bulk amount of formula that ended up then, you know, encouraging mothers to abandon breastfeeding and take up that formula. Including mothers who weren't affected by the emergency at all, because it ended up into the you know, open market where it might be able to fetch, you know, a bigger price and so on. So I think I answered your question at some point.
I know it's a complicated question, but I appreciate your response. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Tracey. I don't know if you have a few, like maybe time for one more question?
Yeah, sure. I'm also.
You'll have to be our last. Oh, you're on mute, Alina. Not working? Can't unmute? No, we can't hear you. Okay, all right, well, let's be back. All right, well, thank you so much, Tracey. This has been very enlightening. I think we all learned a lot, and yeah, this is an ongoing issue because I know that the WHO just put out some regulations around sodas and taxation guidelines for countries. So this issue is not going away. You know, the industry will want to weigh in on these issues. So yeah, thank you so much for giving us some signposts for how to you know, analyze and look at these issues in the future. Well,
thank you very much. Yeah, and I want to say as well about the baby food one is also a very ongoing issue. A lot of times people think that it was something that was resolved, but it's something still ongoing. In many countries, they're struggling a great deal still with that. And just as a closing note, I've dropped in the chat a link to a film called Tigers, which is a dramatization of a whistleblower that I worked with in Pakistan. He was a Nestle employee and he became a whistleblower to expose some of the marketing practices that Nestle was undertaking through him that undermine breastfeeding there. And it's by an Oscar award-winning, Academy Award-winning director. It stars some couple big Bollywood names and also even a few from Hollywood. A former Bond girl plays a composite character that includes me. So I've dropped the link there if anyone's interested in viewing that. It's in English and Hindi with English subtitles.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again so much, Tracey. And well, we look forward to seeing your future publications as they come out further. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.
I had, she's gone, right?
Yeah, she will be soon.
I was having lunch with a K Street lobbyist. So K Street is where all the lobbyists are in Washington.